All right, so in this video, what we want to look at is being able to find the least common denominator, okay? To be able to find the least common denominator, we first have to be able to find the least common multiple. That's what we had just looked at. After we do that, after we find that least common multiple for all of the denominators, right? So when we're looking at a fraction, what we really care about to get a common denominator is the denominator. Okay, so we want to find that least common denominator between all of our denominators. We call that the LCD. Once we've found that least common denominator, then what we need to do is we need to get our fraction in terms of that common denominator. So what that's going to look like is I'm going to have to multiply the numerator and the denominator by whatever I need to get to that least common denominator. Okay, so let's kind of look at what that might look like here. Okay, before we start with all these variables, let's just look at a real quick example of just regular fractions. So let's say, for example, we had the numbers 2/3 and 4/5. Okay, and so I want to be able to come up with the least common denominator. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my denominators and I say, okay, I've got a 3 and a 5. So the least common multiple between 3 and 5 is going to be 15. So now what I want to do is I need to figure out, okay, well, how am I going to get from this 3 to 15? Well, I'm going to have to multiply by 5. But remember the golden rule of algebra, what I do to one, I have to do to all. Okay, so if I'm going to have to multiply the bottom by 5, I'm going to have to multiply the numerator by 5. That's what I mean by multiplying the numerator and the denominator by all the factors needed to acquire this 15 here, or the least common multiple. Okay, so what that's going to look like, now I would have 10 over 15. Okay, so I want to do the same thing in the next fraction. I need it to equal 15. So I got to multiply by a 3 on this one, which is going to give me 12 over 15. Now, at first you're like, well, I could simplify those. Exactly. They would simplify down to 2/3 and 5 and 4/5. But what we're trying to do is undo that simplifying. So we're trying to get a fraction that's actually unsimplified. All right, so let's give it a try now with our variables. Okay, it's the same idea. All we're going to do is we're going to amp it up a little bit because our least common multiple is now going to have variables. Okay, so looking at this first example, I want to find the least common multiple between x and 5x squared plus x. So remember what we did is we wanted to factor. So if I look, the first one's already factored, but the second one I could bring out an x, which is going to give me 5x plus 1. So the least common multiple between my x and my x times 5x plus 1 is actually going to be x times 5x plus 1, right? Okay, so now when I look at that, I say, okay, well, if that is indeed the least common multiple, I need x to equal 5x plus 1 times x. Well, it's already got the x, so what it needs is a 5x plus 1. So that 2 over x needs to get multiplied by 5x plus 1, top and bottom. All right, so that's going to leave me with 10x plus 2 over x times 5x plus 1. And typically with the denominator, I don't actually multiply it out. I leave the denominator alone, but I do stuff to the numerator. That's going to make a little bit more sense whenever we start to do things with these fractions next time when we actually add them or subtract them, because remember the whole idea is leave the denominator alone and I add or subtract the numerators. Okay, so it's going to make a little bit more sense when we get to that later. All right, so now that we've got our first fraction finished, let's look at our second fraction. So our second fraction, I need to have an x times a 5x plus 1. I already have an x times a 5x plus 1. So the second fraction needs nothing. I can leave it alone. Because it already has that common denominator. Okay? So my answer would be 10x plus 2 over x times 5x plus 1 and 3x over x times 5x plus 1. Okay? Let's look at our next one here. So I want to first, looking at those denominators, right? I'm going to look at my denominators here. I need to go ahead and factor this second denominator. It can multiply by a 2. Then I have x squared minus 4, which can continue to factor to x plus 2 and x minus 2. Okay, so what I'm really looking at is 6x squared and 2x plus 2x minus 2. Okay, that's what I want to find the least common multiple of. So let's do it. Well, I know the least common multiple between 2 and 6 is going to be 6, right? Because if I listed them out, 2 is 0, 2, 4, 6. 6 is 0, 6. And there's my least common multiple. Okay? Then it's going to need the x. Between the two, there's only one x, and it's an x squared. So I'm going to keep that. And then I'm going to need my x plus 2, and I'm going to need my x minus 2. Okay, so we've got a lot here in this least common multiple. Okay, so let's see what we would need to do. Looking at my first fraction, 5 over 6x squared. I've already got that 6x squared, but what I need is the x plus 2 and the x minus 2. So I'm going to need to multiply 5 times my x plus 2 times my x minus 2. Well, I know that x plus 2 times x minus 2, if I FOIL that back out, would be x squared minus 4. So when I start distributing, I'm going to distribute my 5 to that value there. Okay, so I'm going to get 5x squared minus 20 on the top if I multiplied it all the way out. Remember, I'm going to just leave that denominator. I'm not doing anything to it. Right? Now, my other fraction that I'm going to have, I have my x plus 1 over my 2x plus 2 times x minus 2. Now, multiplying 2 to get to 6, right, because I need the 6x squared. Multiplying 2 to get to 6, I'm going to need to multiply it by a 3. I also need an x squared. Now, I already have the x plus 2 and the x minus 2, so all I need to do is multiply by a 3x squared. So I'm going to distribute that x and that 1. So I'm going to get 3x cubed plus 3x squared over that denominator, 6x squared times x plus 2 times x minus 2. Okay. All right, so let's look at this next one here. Same idea, I want to come up with the least common multiple. So I'm going to look at my two denominators. I've got an x plus 1 and I've got an x plus 2. So the least common multiple here is just x plus 1 times x plus 2. Similar to our very first thing here where we looked at the 3 and the 5. Sometimes it's easy enough just to multiply the two together. That's the least common multiple. All right, so let's see what this first fraction will need. I start off with 5 over x plus 1. To get to the common denominator, I'm going to need to multiply by an x plus 2. All right, so that means I'm going to now be distributing that 5, which is going to give me 5x plus 10 over that x plus 1 times x plus 2. All right, now let's look at our next fraction. So our next fraction, we had x minus 3 over x plus 2. To get to the common denominator, I'm going to need to multiply by an x plus 1, because that is what it will need. All right, so on the top, I'm going to distribute this out to everything here. So I'm going to end up getting x squared minus 2x minus 3 over x plus 2 times x plus 1. Right? That would be my answers. Okay. Hopefully we're getting the hang of it. Let's try a couple more just to make sure we've really got it. Looking at my next problem here, need everything factored, so I need to go ahead and factor this denominator here. I'm going to have x plus 3, x plus 4. Okay, so I'm looking at this x plus 3 and I'm looking at this x plus 3 times x plus 4. My least common multiple is going to be x plus 3 times x plus 4. Remember, because they both share an x plus 3, I only need to write it one time. All right, so let's fix our fractions now. My first fraction said x plus 2 over x plus 3. It's going to need an x plus 4 to become that common denominator. So multiplying that out here, I'm going to get x squared plus 6x plus 8 over that x plus 3 times x plus 4. Okay. Looking at my next fraction, I had x plus 1 over x plus 3 times x plus 4. Guess what? I don't need anything, right? It already has the common denominator. So that second one is already finished. Okay. So let's look at our next one here. Let's factor it. I'm going to have x minus 5 and I'm going to have x plus 4. All right, so I'm going to look at my x minus 5 from the first denominator and my x minus 5 times my x plus 4. My least common multiple, they both have that x minus 5, so I need that on there once. Okay. Then I also need that x plus 4. Okay. So we're going to now go fix our fractions. I've got 2 over x minus 5. I need an x plus 4 to get to that common denominator. So I'm going to distribute out. I'll have 2x plus 8 over x minus 5 times x plus 4. I look at my next denominator. I've got x minus 1 over that x minus 5 times x plus 4. I notice again, just like the last problem, that my second fraction doesn't need anything. It already contains that least common denominator. So those two fractions are now finished. All right. Okay, let's look at one more, make sure we really got it. This one I'm going to have to factor both of my two fractions. So the first one is going to factor x plus 3 times x plus 2. The second one's going to factor x plus 1, x plus 2. Right? Coming up with that least common multiple, I'm going to need an x plus 3. I'm going to need an x plus 2. I'm going to need an x plus 1. I do not need that second x plus 2 because remember, when they share it, I only need it once. Okay? So let's go fix those fractions. I start off with my first fraction, which is x over x plus 3 times x plus 2. So to get to that common denominator, I'm going to need to multiply by an x plus 1. Okay, so multiplying the top is going to give me x squared plus x over that common denominator, x plus 3, x plus 2, x plus 1. Okay, looking at my second fraction, I've got a 2 over x plus 1 times x plus 2. Now I'm going to need that x plus 3 this time. All right, so multiplying that out, I'm going to have 2x plus 6 over that common denominator, x plus 1 times x plus 2 times x plus 3. So those would be my two fractions. Right? So remember what we did here. We found that least common multiple of all of those denominators. Okay, that's going to be the tricky part, being able to find those least common multiple. Then after we've done that, we say, okay, well, what do I need for each fraction? And it's going to be different for each fraction. What do I need to multiply by each fraction to obtain that least common multiple or the least common denominator at this point? Once I find out what I need, I'm going to multiply it by the numerator and the denominator.